Welcome. I'm Katarina Czarniak. I'm Managing Director of Philanthropy in the Global Philanthropist Circle at Synergos. I'm so thrilled to have you all with us today from all across the globe for our session, our virtual convening New Views on Trust and Philanthropy. I think you're all here today because you agree that this topic could not be more timely and relevant. The philanthropy landscape is evolving each day, it seems, and we're not entirely sure where we're headed. We see more big commitments from donors, more collaborations formed, and at the same time, we're hearing more and more about the significant difficulties nonprofits will face, as well as the communities they serve in the coming year to perhaps 3 years. It's an uncertain time, and we at Synergos find that during such times, dialogue can be a great source of hope. So with that, we hope that these next 90 minutes are going to be an exploration of the role of trust in philanthropy and how we as individuals and institutions can really walk the walk of trust to bring about paradigmatic shifts in the relationships we hold with others and within ourselves. With that, Bobby Thompson, my colleague and Director of Development at Synergos, will kick off our dialogue. Again, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Kate. It's exciting to be here for our virtual convening today. I'm grateful for so many participants. This is our 6th virtual convening hosted by Synergos. While most of our convenings like this are exclusively for the Synergos community of philanthropists and partners, this one is open. So I'm pleased to see such a large turnout from around the globe, as Kate said. I see we have participation from Mexico, from Brazil, from Japan, South Africa, the Netherlands, Israel, and I'm calling in from my spare bedroom in Summit, New Jersey. So welcome, everybody. As Kate commented, trust is such an important value to cherish, but oftentimes we don't stop to consider just how integral trust is in everything we do, including philanthropy. Just out of curiosity, as I was preparing for this convening, I Googled TED Talks on the topic of trust, sort of a tongue twister now that I think about it, and discovered that there were no less than 19 talks on trust on the internet that 36 million people have viewed. And these are just TED Talks. In one of the most viewed segments, the speaker talked about how to build professional trust, maintain it, and rebuild it when it's broken. She commented that if we can learn to trust one another more, we can have unprecedented human progress. I think that's a great segue into our discussion today. So I have the privilege and pleasure to introduce our 2 guest panelists, English Sall and John Esterle. They bring a wealth of knowledge and practical advice about the role that trust plays in philanthropy. So John, a little bit about him, is the co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, a grant-making foundation in San Francisco, California. He started work at the Whitman Institute as a research associate back in 1988 and became the executive director in 1999. John also serves as a trustee and advisor on numerous nonprofit boards and has written, blogged, and spoken extensively on our subject today. English is a next-gen philanthropist, as they call themselves, those that are obviously younger than us, but sort of the 20 and 30-somethings, and a board member of the Sall Family Foundation, which supports environmental causes, global development programs, and projects based in Raleigh, North Carolina. Like John, English also serves on numerous nonprofit boards, including CARE USA, the Aspen Management Partnership for Health, and the END Fund. English is currently pursuing her PhD in industrial organizational psychology at North Carolina State University and specializes in humanitarian work psychology. She'll tell you a little bit more about that as we get into our conversation. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to pose my first question to John. John, we've seen a lot of press and dialogue these last 2 months about trust and philanthropy. We'll talk about COVID's role, the coronavirus's role in this conversation later. But first, I'd like to ask you to start off by saying a few words, because you have actually been championing trust-based philanthropy for years through your work at the Whitman Institute and now with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. Can you share a few words about the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and what inspired you to take on the philanthropic establishment to change the power dynamic that favors the funder rather than creating authentic partnerships based on trust, transparency, vulnerability, and even humility?
Yes, thanks, Bobby, and thanks to Synergos for inviting me to be part of this discussion today. I'm really looking forward to it. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. I'd say the roots of my attitude around trust and philanthropy started more informally when we first began making grants back in 2005. And there were just some practices that made inherent sense to me. Unrestricted funding. If we're supporting you, we trust you how to best spend the money. Evolved into making multi-year commitments over time. I was starting out the only full-time staff member, so I really favored streamlined processes rather than a lot of proposals and reports. So took that approach, a more dialogic learning approach to our relationships with our grantee partners. And from the beginning explored ways that we could provide support beyond the check. And basically approaching from a place of how can we serve you rather than what do you do to have to prove you're worthy of us. And I found in those stances and in the invitation to relationship, not a requirement, but an invitation, trust was built. And we found our approach was different from many foundations. So I began kind of speaking and writing to some degree. But it wasn't until we made the decision in 2012 to spend out that I'd say our formal intentionality around being an advocate in the field really came into being. We made the decision to spend out in 2022. And so one of the first things we decided to do was work with the Center for Effective Philanthropy to do a grantee perception report. What we heard back really informed our thinking. One, we got very, very positive reviews about our approach, which was affirming. It was good to check our own assumptions. But the two pieces that really fueled this last chapter in our work was, one, we had a question we could ask our partners: what are your ideas about how we best leverage our resources as we look to spend out? And it came through kind of loud and clear. They said, we want you to advocate for how you fund within philanthropy. So we had that urge to advocate. And then CEP said, we want to highlight this theme that keeps coming up in people's comments. And that's how important it is that they feel trusted by you. So we sat with that feedback of trust and advocate. And with that, we brought on Pia Infante as my co-executive director to help us become more outward facing. The first part of that was kind of naming and framing our approach, which we kind of broke down into what are now 6 principles that are called trust-based philanthropy, and started advocating first just from our own stance as the Institute. Over time, we had Waters Foundation and others join us, not only in saying this framework really resonated with them, multi-year unrestricted funding, streamlined paperwork, support beyond the check, listening and acting on feedback, open and transparent communication, what we call doing the homework. These things are on our website, Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. But more importantly, they said, we not only want to practice in these ways and use this language, but we want to advocate along with you. So over time, the one of the Institute started to become many, and formally launched this past January the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, framed as a collaborative funder initiative, a 5-year initiative to make trust-based philanthropy the norm in philanthropy. And I'll just end by saying the timing of our launch of the project, followed by what has happened with the pandemic, has actually brought what we have been talking about to the fore, in that many funders are now advocating for these types of approaches, even if they don't call it trust-based philanthropy.
That's great. And I've read this, this trust-based philanthropy model that's on the website. I'm really impressed with it. And I just hope all of our funders, philanthropy world, adopt this and we'll be advocates for that. English, I have the next question for you, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to anything John said before we continue. Is there anything you want to say before I move on to the next question?
Sure. No, I mean, just to echo some of the points that John has made in the true, I mean, clearly just so important. You know, trust-based philanthropy, I think, is a movement right now, and I think moving towards this type of relationship and type of dynamic and the vision of what that future state is, I think is just crucial. And I have read, you know, what I'm about it and what's on the website, and I highly recommend it.
Thanks. So actually, I'm going to continue talking about trust-based philanthropy for a moment in my question to you. And specifically, I just wanted to know what resonates most with you about this model, this trust-based philanthropy model, and how important do you feel trust is in developing the relationships with your grantees at the Sall Family Foundation and the other organizations and communities you serve as a board member? And if possible, can you give us an example or two of how that works?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Bobby. And I'm really excited to be here today and recognize some familiar faces here, which is wonderful. Yeah, you know, I think this is just such an important topic, especially right now. And I know we're going to get to talking about some of the elements of trust-based philanthropy, especially under the umbrella of what we're experiencing now with COVID-19. But the thing that really comes to mind, especially, you know, hearing some of the points that John has, a good friend, David Milestone, I think a few of you on this call might know, he once told me that, you know, progress goes at the pace of trust. And I think that sentiment has just resonated so much with me as a philanthropist, as a board member, as a team member, you know, just as a person attempting to navigate dynamics and relationships in the world. And I think what is so crucial and so important is that, you know, if you come to an interaction with the ability to trust other people in the interaction, in the group, the outcome is just, it's so much more productive. And it really does enable the level of progress that I think is just absolutely necessary for the world of global development and tackling some of these really complex problems that we're all striving to solve. And so I think, you know, when it comes to my role, especially within the foundation, I think that, you know, coming to a relationship, coming to a dynamic with a grantee, with another funder, with a team member, and sort of just coming to it from a perspective of wanting to trust, it has just made so much more of my work really more enjoyable more joyful, but more productive.
So I really appreciate your response, English, and I wanted to turn it back over to John and ask if there was anything that English shared that, John, you wanted to respond to or to add before I get into our next question.
Just that it was the first time I'd heard English talking, about more specifically her approach and foundation. I guess what I would build on is, we're increasingly aware of each other's work, I think, in this moment, as we're talking about the importance of trust and how that manifests in our individual foundations. And so I think, the point she raised just about learning from others and lifting up what others are doing is really important for us right now. I think as funders and donors, we're in this moment where it's important for us to do what I call learning out loud with each other. And so in her comments, that's what I'm first responding to, is how important it is just to be hearing from other peers about their practice of this and their values around this, because we're different institutions, so we bring our own nuances to how we approach this.
Yeah, now you're so right. Listening, effective listening is such an important quality that goes hand in hand with developing trust with another person or organization. John, let me turn our attention for a moment to the pandemic crisis, which is on everyone's mind. We're in this and the impact that it's having on every facet of humanity that we've seen across the news pretty much 24/7. In fact, we're experiencing what I feel is a shared vulnerability in ways that just 10 weeks ago we had never imagined would be the case. There's a lot of fear out there, and no one really knows how this is going to end or if it ever will. So my question is, do you think that these circumstances that we're living through now create a greater need to trust? And if so, what are some concrete ways funders and donors can create a more trusting relationship with the communities they support in a time of uncertainty?
Mm-hmm. I think the need for trust has always been great, and this moment is highlighting that need much more intensely, I think, than it has been. So my first response in a concrete way would be to these practices that we have as trust-based philanthropy. I think they're now more true than ever. If you are not doing unrestricted funding, I would convert your project grants to unrestricted grants. If you're making unrestricted grants, continue to make them. And if you can, make multi-year commitments. There's so much uncertainty now, and I think a lot of fear and anxiety about what's going to happen a year from now and 2 years from now. So if you could give people a sense that you're going to be there for them past this year, hugely important. I would check in, if you can, with all of your partners and just listen. What do you need? How can we be helpful? Are there other things that we can be doing? My experience is there's a range of things that you could probably be doing, one of which, listening and just being a sounding board, is helpful. There may be ways you can help as a connector and a convener, even virtually. We did a thing we called office hours so that people could come together as a group or individually to check in with us. You could lighten, if you have a lot of requirements around reporting and proposals, I would urge you to lighten up on those, or just dispense with them for the moment and maybe go to a more conversational approach if you're wanting to check in with people. Explore how to open doors perhaps to other funders. Look at ways that you can highlight their work. What will help build trust right now is not just talk, but action. And it's putting this into concrete practice. So the degree that people can see that they can turn to you, that you'll be supportive in what other ways you can, and that you believe in them and are behind them and are demonstrating that. Another thing many foundations are doing and many are being urged to do is to actually increase your funding at this time. Give more. Traditionally, foundations contract in this type of environment and they move to protect their endowments. If you actually say, no, we're responding in a different way, that builds trust too. So I think these are all kind of concrete examples things that people can start doing. I think it's really important to be concrete in your actions right now, and not be overly directive. Actually come from a place of service.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I would totally agree. And maybe to get English's advice on this, I might incorporate into your comments, English, about that question before moving on to the next one, something that someone chatted about, and that is, since you sit on the board of the Sall Family Foundation and others, in this time of uncertainty, how are you approaching a new grantee? And is your boards willing to take a higher level of risk? And obviously there's other parts to this question, but I'm just wondering if you could respond to that as we move through our discussion here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to echo the points that John has made around, how to build trust from the onset of these relationships by, using the tool of unrestricted funding, really just intentional listening to grantees, asking them what they need, asking them what's keeping them awake at night, and really trying to meet them where they are in this time that is so difficult to navigate, and not expecting things of our grantees that we can't answer ourselves about the future and about certain forecasting or things like that. And I think that's just been a crucial approach for us, and trying to demonstrate, trying to be a friend first and a donor second, I think is something that we've tried to really exhibit in our relationships. And yes, I think that we're having conversations at all the board levels that I sit on all the time about, not overburdening, overburdening grantees and overburdening our partners with too many requirements, and really trying to take the conversation one day at a time about what is needed, how can we be helpful, how can we show up as really being supportive, how can we manage and mitigate risk in a completely different way, and really take on more risk than we would have, because I think everybody's doing that. The grantees are doing that, the funders are doing that, and I think it's necessary during this time, because there is so much unknown, but there is a level of trust and a level of just shared humanity that we're all in this together, and there is still a future state that we all envision where the world is better, and we're just going to have to work together, hand in hand to try and achieve that. And that's that's been true for a long time, but it's even more highlighted and potent right now.
Well, and that brings me to my next question to you. How can we build trust faster when there is a greater sense of urgency in the work that needs to get done, whether it's developing a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus, or feeding the homeless, and the food insecure, or even restoring our environment that has become so toxic? what are some tricks of the trade, so to speak, but authentically developing that trust relationship that's going to be so important in the weeks and months ahead between funders and the community and the communities they serve and fund?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And I think a lot of it comes back to feeling comfortable with a certain amount of vulnerability and being okay saying, I don't know. And I think that, you know, one thing that I found, and I am, you know, lucky enough to be in partnership with, you know, some other funders who are really just truly able to show kind of that vulnerability and make the environment, make the working environment that we're all in very psychologically safe. And that really just looks like feeling safe to ask questions, feeling safe to be wrong, and allowing, you know, others the grace for the same thing. And I think, you know, there's very interesting indicators, right, around sort of what makes up a psychologically safe environment. And there's an interesting study that came out a couple years ago about what psychologically safe environments look like in teams. And there was one indicator that they brought up that actually the more frequently people cuss in emails, the more psychologically safe the environment was. And so just thinking about these things when you're interacting with one another and showing a certain level of vulnerability, and, you know, that can even look like sort of, you know, bridging this moment in time we're having where you are talking about things, you know, you're talking about your home life, you're talking about your kids, you're catching up, and you're asking questions about people's well-being, you know, in a moment that those questions really need to be asked, whether you're a donor or a grantee or a partner, and really just putting the human element, I think, first really starts to embody that trust and that psychologically safe environment.
You know, it's so true. I just remembered as you said that an aha moment I had with a funder years ago when we were on a donor field trip in Mozambique, and we were having dinner, and we were talking about the impact that our funding was having in the area. But we got off on a family conversation about realizing that we both had special needs children. And that was a bonding, a connector for us that actually has existed to this day. And we still have phone calls with each other about, you know, how we deal with the issues as a parent of a special needs child. And that trust that was developed in that moment was greater than any other conversation we had. So thank you for sharing that. Let me move into our final question before we go into our breakout rooms. And this is really to both of you. And I'll leave it to which one wants to respond first, but it's sort of an open-ended question. And that is, what advice about trust would you like to share with our group today that will encourage them, as I've just shared, to be more vulnerable and transparent and humble? I think it's really important that this point that we're getting across here, but obviously, you know, it takes work for some people more than others. So what advice would you give those that are listening in as to how they can be more vulnerable and transparent and humble to those that are their funders, and for funders to the communities they fund?
I can go first. Just a couple things, just still responding a little bit. I just love the way English brought up the importance of saying, I don't know, and the way she talked about vulnerability and psychological safety, really important. That subject of risk came up, and it often comes up. And I would just say it is curious to me sometimes how there's a lot of talk about risk within philanthropy and risk taking. And sometimes I think it's worthwhile interrogating what people mean by risk and what they see as risk. To me, as a funder, the risk is that somebody we're funding will do something funky with the money. That's the risk to me. If you believe in the integrity of the people you're supporting, you're trusting they're going to make a good faith effort to be accomplishing their mission. Now, or their work. Now, it may not happen. Stuff happens. Things, in my experience, usually take longer than people think and how they're doing, and some things won't work. It's curious to me sometimes. I think everybody in philanthropy want to take risks that succeed. And so partly it's allowing that some things might not work. And so I think within philanthropy, this is a problem in that we don't incentivize people to talk about what's not working because of the structures we have set up. So sometimes I think if we talk about data-driven philanthropy, in general, we're creating systems where people don't feel they can talk about what's really going on. So we're actually missing a huge amount of data that could inform our thinking. So I would just say, as we go along, to explore ways that we can shift that dynamic. And certainly support and unrestricted support over time makes an important factor in that. And then I would just add that as we think about building trust, what we talk about at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, yes, we're talking about the relationship of funders and grantee partners, but what we're really talking about and want to create are ecosystems of trust. So I would ask people to think about how can you build trust internally and externally. Staff with staff, staff with boards, that's a big one. How can you be aligned internally? How can you build trust with other funders? How can you build trust with the communities and the nonprofits and help nonprofits build trust with each other? So it calls on us to practice these values of vulnerability, humility, curiosity, compassion, and awareness of power and power dynamics into all of our relationships. And so that holding that bigger vision, or that call to walk into every room we're in with these values is really important.
No, that's great, and some good advice for all. And again, putting that into practice, I think sometimes takes time, but it's still critical to frame your conversations, your relationship building and relationship strengthening with the kinds of things that John just mentioned. English, what about you? Any words of advice you can share that would add to or be in addition, enhance what John's just said?
Sure, absolutely. I think some of the language that John just used is so critical around how do we approach these trusting relationships? How do we really dig in and find compassion and align on values? And I'm seeing a few questions come in on the chat around, how do we do this in a way also that it's really intentional about engaging with and supporting and trusting people who may not be like us and who may not look like us. And it's a real issue in philanthropy around gender and minority populations and organizations, led by women or led by people of color. And I think that this is just such a potent and important issue. And I would like to have a more articulate answer, but I think that so much about building this trust and breaking down some of the barriers of trust really has to do with how we broaden our circle of compassion and how we broaden our circle of empathy. Sometimes it's just easier as humans to have empathy for people who are more like us, and who we can recognize similarities in. And I think that we all have to be really intentional, understanding our position as philanthropists and the sort of, power dynamics that creates in how we are really, really intentional about broadening our circle of empathy. And I think one of the things I've realized too is that sometimes it's easier, even tangentially, to, for example, have empathy or have compassion or sympathy for the, beneficiary populations that I'm trying to change something for or trying to add value to. And even harder sometimes to have empathy or compassion for the actual, organization that is operationalizing that change. So the actual organization or organizational leader that is the grantee. And I think that we just have to really think about the types of groups and communities that our grantees and that our beneficiaries are part of, and how do we ensure we're elevating those voices and giving, just really sort of democratizing our influence and our power to the voices of the communities that we're trying to serve. And that to me is just a really important area to build trust in more intentionally and more strategically.
Yeah, no, you're so right, and I know there's a lot of information that is being shared back and forth. I saw some of the questions. I really appreciate your addressing that specific question from Katie in a way that hopefully was helpful to her. I know that we can continue a conversation like this for another hour, but we have a limited time. So I want to first just thank both you and John for helping us look at this issue of trust, and specifically trust-based philanthropy, and how it's changing the landscape between the funder and donor and the community. I really feel like we're at a inflection point in philanthropy where all of this is going to come together in a way that's going to benefit the causes that we love in greater ways, because it starts with the power of one relationship, one grant, one opportunity to lean in and help someone that needs help. So there's a lot here that we can unpack. We might be able to do some of that in the discussion ahead. And this is at a point where in our virtual convenings that we're literally going to move our group into breakout rooms for a discussion. And we have something that we'd love to share with you then. I hope that you'll stay with us during the next 30 minutes, and then we'll come back together and wrap it up.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I think we're getting most people back in the room from our 2 breakouts. Thanks for staying with us, and I hope you found that your breakout conversations were thought-provoking and interesting. We'll comment on some of the key takeaways from the breakout rooms in the next few minutes. But I wanted to, before we go into the final wrap-up, to turn to John in English for any of your final actions or learnings that really you want to leave us with before we transition to our closing. So John, why don't we start with you?
I would just, actions going forward, I would just say as a resource, if you're interested in looking more about the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and approach and kind of the learning community around that, just to go to trustbasedphilanthropy.org. And then I think just personally, it's just, we are going into such times of massive uncertainty. And so I think the importance of trust as we move forward into such a complex and uncertain world is foundational, I think. And I think we talked about it in the pre-call to this, for me, trust and resilience are interlinked as we move forward, and that we are called on, I think, to really build trust in all aspects of our lives as we move forward. And personally, that's what keeps also me just grounded and centered as the ground is shaking underneath. And so, you know, I'm very relational in my approach and how I bring meaning into the world. And so for me, even as we look at how to shift philanthropy into valuing and practicing trust more, I think it's very relational. I listened to the webinar from last week around general operating support and what can get in the way of that. And that's a whole other discussion. But I think we're being called in this moment to maybe to expand our role of what we do, even as funders, and to go, how can I, in my role, build trust internally with the field, with our partners, and that gets into what, you know, the nuance and the complexities of what we just had in the breakout room around, is trust assumed, is it earned, but really, how is it built? And that's a big question for us going forward.
Thanks so much. And I wish we could have captured it in the breakout room, all the really rich conversation. There were so many thoughts and reflections on what does it look like when it's broken and how do you rebuild from there? And John, you said that another element, which we don't talk about as much, is what if you're extending trust, but the other person doesn't trust you for a variety of reasons, whether that be colonialism or there's just, you know, systemic inequities. And you said, you know, part of being able to build trust is being able to hold the distrust of others and not let that stop you from pursuing and doing what you can to build the trust. So thanks again for leaving us with those thoughts. And English, what actions and learnings are you taking forward from today, and what would you like us to take forward from your perspective?
Sure. I think I definitely want to echo something that John hit on, and that is that this sort of necessary nexus of resilience and trust, and that, you know, resilience, whether it be, you know, individual resilience or community resilience or, you know, just humanity resilience, it's not built in a vacuum. You know, it's not built in isolation, and it requires this thread and connective tissue of trusting one another in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's just so crucial in thinking about this moment in time, because I think a lot of times, you know, when we're in situations of stress and chaos, our initial sort of even biological reaction is fear and paralysis, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think there's something about, you know, for me, just sort of checking myself and saying, like, how do I not lean into this fear and paralysis? How do I lean more into the shared human experience of this moment, and recognizing that, you know, there is more to be gained by trying to break down the barriers and trying to approach situations with a really sort of trusting mindset. And I think that, you know, we just had such rich, wonderful conversations in our breakout group, and I hope that we get to highlight on some of these themes here. But one of the things that I'm really taking away is too, that, like, having a trusting, psychologically safe relationship does not always mean getting what you want, and it doesn't always mean feeling great all the time, you know, in those relationships. But it means that there's trust and support. So even if there's a disagreement, even if it's not rainbows all the time, there's still trust in that, you know what, that person is saying what they need to say to me to move forward in our relationship, in our bond of trust. And I think that that's really valuable. Just knowing that trust doesn't mean everything's amazing and perfect every moment. It just means that you continue to come back for more and show up for one another.
Well said. All right, I'll turn over to Bobby to bring us home and close out our session. Oh, Bobby, we have you on mute still.
Yeah, I just
got you back.
Yeah, I'm still getting this Zoom thing. I'm muted half the time, and I'm speaking. If people could lip read, you wouldn't have to worry about the mute button. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Anyway, it's been a great conversation. I mean, our breakout session, as English said, a lot of rich sharing of the meaning of trust, how trust affects relationships. To John's point, I do feel that the more we move from a transactional to a relational approach in the way that we deal with funders, in the way that funders deal with their communities, that we have this trust that becomes stronger, and a bond that's created in a partnership that can achieve so much more than if it's just a transactional type of opportunity. I loved what someone said in our session. I think it was English's friend, Jeffrey Walker. He said, and they were talking about each other. They both had each other on their mind, and they shared with each other. Jeffrey said that trust ripples. And I love that, where he talked about how, through networking, through a mutual friend, English and Jeffrey met each other, and they had conversations, and they were able to bounce ideas off each other. They developed a friendship, and now it's a very important part of their professional lives, careers, and obviously the friendship they have with each other. But I do feel that this trust thing is a powerful, opportunity to network people into authentic relationships, because it is like throwing a pebble in a lake and seeing the ripples. When you have an authentic relationship in which you trust each other, you can and are able to share that with others that are strangers, and the strangers become friends because they trust you. They know who you are and what you stand for and what you believe, what your values are. Sometimes they're shared, sometimes they're different. It really doesn't matter. What matters most is that trust is developed authentically in a way that we can get more accomplished. So that's my sort of 2 cents. I want to say just a couple of closing statements here. First, I want to thank again English and John. It's been a pleasure getting to know you through our conversations leading up to this session. I so admire what you're doing, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in ways that, Synergos can be a stronger and better organization, and hopefully how we at Synergos can share with others on this call, and you can learn more about us, and we can share with you what we're trying to accomplish to make a difference in the world. And there's a great team that's doing it. I also want to thank our production team. There's always people behind the camera that are making events like this happen so smoothly. And so a real special shout out to Grace, to Ashley, to JT, to Talon, to Max, to Vincent, Carlos, and if there was other people that were involved, thank you as well. I mean, they make this happen. It comes together in a way that I think on our ends, it seems smooth and seamless, but a lot of work goes into these virtual convenings because we want to make them important and impactful to you. I also want to share with you what's on the screen now, just in closing, and that is that we recorded this video, as Kate mentioned at the top of our conversation, and we will email this to you in the next day or two so that you'll have an opportunity to play back those comments that might have really impacted you and been special. And if there's follow-up questions, we're happy to address those as well if you want to reach out to us individually. I also want to invite this group to our next virtual convening next week, titled Emerging from Crisis Through Inclusion. There'll be a different group there, and I think it'll be a great conversation, and we would love to have you part of that. And then lastly, I would say there's much more to Synergos than these virtual convenings. And while we love to do these things and expand our knowledge beyond our own community and to hear from others, there's other experiences that you can become involved in. And we'd love to invite you into learning more about who we are and why we exist and where we're going with our bridging leadership model, which trust is such an important part of. So with that, I think, let me do a time check. We're at 1:28. I'm done. I feel that at this point we'll just sign off and wish everyone a safe and happy and strong day ahead. Thank you for participating in our call. It's been great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all so much.